We played a little clip while we were sorting out our connection as to why people join gangs. How will this, or will this, make any difference to the necessity for gangs, as some people see it, the reason people join?
Well, the thing is that it doesn't really address the social issues that give rise for people to join gangs. And like, we also got to differentiate the different types of gangs, right? So we can't assume that all gangs are the same, just like the use of that term organized crime.
Yep.
Organized crime is a very broad, set of criminal behaviors. And so I think if you actually reflect back, like where this all started was pretty much post Second World War, all right? So you sort of had this sort of like the adoption of Keynesian economics, which meant the growth in manufacturing. And so you kind of had people flocking to the cities to work in the factories. Wellington's a classic because Nai Taita, right? They were the models for the new housing areas. And I think it was 1954, the Mazengarb report came out, and that sort of it's almost like we're repeating the cycle. The Mazengarb report came about because of essentially two things. There was a girl that kind of went missing over a weekend, turned up and said she didn't like a stepfather, had a wonderful weekend of sex with this gang, and then there was those two girls that killed their mother down Christchurch, and that sort of created a whole furore. And Mazengarb, which is a law firm, did this big report, and it was circulating in all the households. And interesting enough, at that time, youth crime was actually going down. But because the pandemonium that was created by this Mazengarb report, it created this moral panic, right? And so if you reflect 1954 to where we are now in 2024, you've got exactly a similar scenario. So from that time, that was the age of the bodgies and widgies, the milk bar cowboys, and eventually the bikies came along. So our people were sort of emulating like the Hells Angels in America, popular youth culture, and all the rest of it, right? So the whole thriving economic situation also meant that there weren't enough people filling in the factories. So we had urban drift coupled with the process of assimilation. So during the Mazengarb report, that period, that whole moral panic, was where your state care came into place. They were known as juvenile delinquents, put into state care. So if you look at the original Mongols, if you like to call them, they were predominantly Pākehā. So the mob is probably the only institution in this country that's been absolutely captured by Māori. So it's the Pākehā, basically Pākehās, the Stefford brothers, the Gary Gerbys. And, Gary actually talks about his time in the boys' home and how he was sexually abused and physically abused. So if you take a look at what's happened with urban drift with Māori, they ended up filling in those boys' homes. But prior to that, the whole thing of tikanga Māori was being stripped away, whether it was the Tohunga Suppression Act, they're not allowed to use the language and all the rest of it. By the time those young boys entered into those boys' homes, where they were sexually and physically and mentally abused. So that's where the violence comes from. So if you want to understand the violence within the sort of indigenous ethnic gangs, that's where it comes from. It was taught to them, all right? So their culture was taken away, a new culture was implanted into them, which is violence and sexual violence. So if you wind the clock back to the 70s and 80s, gang rape was quite a prominent crime, all right? And so if you want to understand the genesis of all that, where does it come from? So on one hand, you take away the culture and then you implant a new culture. And so these people, when they were 16, they were released. They were no longer a state ward. They were basically just thrown out on the street. So in that process, people become institutionalized, right? And no one lives in a cultural void. So they've adopted a new culture of violence. And that's probably where the no narking rule comes from, right? No narking, so you don't narc off your perpetrators who were your carers, whether it was in the boys' home in Ipuni or in Lake Hellas, you don't narc, right? So that's filtered through. And so So if you want to look at the bikie gangs, why I say they're different, they're a generational phenomenon, right? So if you take a look here in Wellington, you know, you had like the 25 Club back in the 60s and 70s. And by the early 70s, they were gone. They were replaced by the Satan Slaves, right? And likewise in Timaru, there was the Highwaymen, Dunedin, there's Coffin Cheaters. And by the 70s, you had the Road Knights, the Epitaph Riders. Was a whole different generation of bike gangs. And now there's another generation, predominantly influenced by the 501s, right? So there are different reasons for joining gangs, right? So if you want to look at the indigenous ethnic gangs, which is where the biggest gangs are, so if you follow the whakapapa that I've just explained to you, those people that were released from those homes were heavily traumatized. That trauma has never been treated. So we've got intergeneration transfer of dysfunction going into the fourth generation. All right. So if we keep on doing the stuff like tough on crime, put them into boot camps and all the rest and traumatize them some more, it's going to be even worse. Right. It's not an answer. So do we want to fix the problem and put our hands up and say, as the state, we did a terrible thing here? So it's really interesting how quiet the Royal Commission Interstate Care has been, because they're not part of this conversation, where in fact they should be.